Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to be looking at some more fonts. Since you're now familiar with all the basics of typography, we'll just be taking another tour of different typefaces as cataloged in this book, Type, The History of Visual Type by Paul McNeill. We'll be covering a number of different fonts, a couple early ones, but I think the ones I've tabbed for this video are mostly more modern. And yes, we will of course be covering Comic Sans by popular demand, of course. But we can go ahead and get started. I don't normally ask people to like or subscribe. People will make that decision for themselves, but that support does help me. So if you're enjoying the content, I encourage you to like the videos, and if you haven't, please do subscribe. The first typeface that we're looking at is called Subiaco, and this one is interesting in that it was created by a couple of Italians. They had studied printing in Germany in its very early days, but when they returned to Italy to start printing, they felt a need to create a typeface that was using the forms of the writing being used for books in Italy at that time, different from the blackface style lettering used in Germany, which would lead roughly in one way or another to the typefaces we call Roman. This is, as I said, an early font, around 1465, and in Italy. Next, here we have Grandjean's Roman. Grandjean was a fairly prolific type designer. The font he produced here is similar in many ways to Garamond, but with its own unique aspects and flair. It was highly regarded and an influence on some fonts that would come later, one of which we will have a look at. One of the interesting things he did when he moved to Italy was to actually work on Middle Eastern fonts. Catholic missionaries wanted things printed for their efforts in the Middle East, so some of the early work printing in Middle Eastern fonts. This font was from around 1560. And we're going to jump forward a bit to the end of the 18th century to look at Bodoni. In the other fonts video I put out, we looked at Dito. Bodoni is a very similar font. Came out right around the same time. They're considered very modern, part due to the strong contrast between thick and thin strokes in the letters. I have adapted this font into one exclusively used for Greek letters on fraternity houses. I call it Bodoni. Please inquire in the comment box below about pricing. Dito would produce a number of notable typefaces, Bodoni would produce a number of typefaces that were highly regarded. But he laid out 4 principles which he thought underlined good type design. Regularity, clarity, good taste, and charm. Speaking of Dito, he also produced some very lovely script typefaces based on calligraphy of the day. There are actually a couple different kinds represented here. On this side of the page, I have what is called Anglais, based on the English roundhand style of writing. And this was a result of a shift from a traditionally flat calligraphy pen to a pointed nub on the pen, which ended up changing how the strokes were created, which is reflected here. As a style of writing that would become popular throughout Europe and the United States in this time period. Or rather, the 1600s, when that type of writing was popular. These fonts come in the early 1800s. The font on the other page is called Ronde, and it is based off a type of writing commonly used by French state officials. It is very elegant and ornamented. You can see the interesting design of this C and in these other letters. Very interesting style of script. This is the Latin typeface. It is reflective of shifts in the 1800s to more production of advertising materials, attempts to catch the consumer's eye. This is, outside of that purpose, it is not an overly significant font, but it has some interesting characteristics that make it quite distinctive visually. These very sharp triangular serifs and details like this angled stroke in the H. You can also see that sharp look in the G with its serif. The Dove's type was a typeface produced by a private printing press. It set books in this typeface, which was considered to be very beautiful, with very nicely laid out printings of these books. It was noteworthy and of such value to the company that when a dispute broke out between the founders, one of them took the blocks from the press and threw them all in the Thames River so they would not be able to be taken away by the other. So in a sense, this typeface was lost to the world in its original sense, though it was often copied. In recent years, someone actually hired divers to go down in the Thames and recover some of the original dies. So a modern designer was able to use them to actually authentically create a new form of the Dove's type using those letter forms recovered from the river. It's pretty wild. But kind of cool that it was preserved in that way too. This is Aorial, designed by a Frenchman, and it is a supreme example of Art Nouveau in typography. It really became a signature look for Art Nouveau with its style. Very evocative of a certain era, and in particular really became to be associated with Paris. You can see it. It's quite interesting letter forms, almost stencil or like calligraphy, and how there are separations between strokes. And quite a flowing look to many of the letters. Up next we have Cheltenham. This is a font that became incredibly popular in America in the early 20th century. It was widely used within American advertising up until fashions really changed in the 1930s. I think one of the distinctive and interesting things about this font is the shape of this G, kind of unusual protuberance forming that letter. Now we will jump ahead to some much more modern fonts. Modern really in the sense of starting with the mid-20th century. We'll start with Melior, which was designed by Hermann Zapf, who we of course know and love from Zapf Dingbats. Likely his name was Hermann Zapf. But he designed this font likely inspired by Piet Hein, who was a scientist, mathematician, and poet, a combination we don't see enough of anymore, who had published work stating that the superellipsoid was a far superior shape in aesthetics than the oval or rectangle. The superellipsoid being a bit of a slightly more square ellipse that you can see in the shapes like the O and the E. It is a very pleasing font to look at, though. I cannot vouch for the solidity of the argument about the superellipsoid, as I have not read Hein's work on the subject, I will admit, though I'm curious. Here we have Stylo Future. Stylo means upright. And this was designed by Paul Renner, originally as a display typeface, but one he worked on for many years. They assigned it the name Futura, even though it really has almost nothing in common with that font. This has geometric aspects, but more influences from handwriting and a more even character width. This ends up being quite nicely legible in a different way than Futura is. It is really a whole new font, but grouped together on the basis of naming, though in different markets would be called Bauer Topic. And here we have a French font called Mistral. It was developed in 1953 it was really a font that was meant to flow in the way that handwriting flows. You can definitely see that in the letters. It's a very distinctive look. It became hugely popular. I'm sure you're likely to have seen it in advertisements, or really it's been in so many places. It was very popular in its time, becoming ubiquitous. The same designer also produced a font called Chalk, which has similar aspects in that it feels handwritten, though in this case the intention is more as if it is constructed with a brush strokes forming the letter shapes. Again, it was very well received, quite distinctive. I believe his name was Roger Excoffin. The French pronunciation definitely eludes me. This is Folio. At first glance, you might think it looks a bit like Helvetica. And there is very much a reason for that. They both draw from a similar root. The font accidents grotesque. Folio probably stays more true to the original font. And it was a very nicely designed, very usable font, but coming out at the same time as Helvetica and Universe was overshadowed by the massive popularity of those two. Here we have Meridian, which I suppose is a apropos choice to include in an ASMR video. ASMR. 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 Meridian was designed by Adrian Frutiger, who I mentioned in the last video. He's produced a number of fonts that I really love. This font was meant to be very readable. It has some interesting details in that these vertical strokes are not perfectly vertical, actually a bit concave. So it adds just a bit of shape and flow to them. Can also probably make out some of the ligatures in this font, these double Fs, the FI, Frutiger said about this font that he wanted reading it to feel like you were strolling through a forest rather than walking down some dour suburban street. It's a really lovely way of looking at it, and it is a very nice font. Here we have Optima. This is another Rupp font. And the inspiration for this one came when he was visiting Florence doing research. And he found a particular style of letters engraved on a 15th century tomb. He didn't happen to have paper with him to record the shapes, so he actually drew them on an Italian banknote. It's the start of his work on this font. And it is very nice that it is a sans serif font that still retains a lot of the feel of handwritten work. Moving on. Transport. This font was specifically designed for signage on British motorways. It was created in the 50s so that there could be unified and legible signage on British roads, similar to the railway font that in the last video was intentionally designed for legibility. The designers said that the question they asked to help inform the design of the typeface was, what do I want to know reading a sign at speed? Led them to produce a clear font, but also a structure for those signs to help make them visually recognizable. And this is still the only font used on the British motorway system. Here we have Typha. Don't know if that's how you say it or not. It is a Czech font. There was a lot less information about fonts behind the Iron Curtain in the 20th century. This was a successful Czech font that there were attempts to bring over to the West that fell through. It's an interesting example of something that was outside of the mainstream of Western typography at the time. something a little more playful. This one is called Adlib, and it uses a lot of the feel of some of the geometric fonts, but pokes a bit of fun by moving things around a bit and having these square, really just not square, quadrilateral shapes and letters like the O and P. I think for many of us, this font will feel very familiar because once it came out in the 60s, it was pretty widely used, especially in things like cartoons, which is probably where many of us have seen it. Here we have Euro style, which I think is one of those fonts that just has a particular look and evokes a certain time period. I think many designers feel that way at this point. At the time of its release, it was meant to be very contemporary, and it was heavily used, which probably helped create those associations that it just sort of belonged to that time period. This was based on super elliptical forms, like we discussed earlier. So you get those more rectangular, round letters. It was hugely popular, but perhaps the consequence of that has fallen out of fashion. This is an interesting one, is Quadrato. It was created to be used for a specific model of typewriter produced by Olivetti, the Valentine, which became very much an icon. It was a bright red typewriter. It was portable, very fashionable, designed at the time. There were other colors, but red, it turned into a cultural icon. I believe there's one in the Museum of Modern Art, that sort of level of cultural icon. But Quadrato was kind of a unique take on typewriter fonts to be used in the Valentine. The creator of the Valentine called it an anti-machine machine. So it was to be used any place but an office. So there was a certain playfulness and quirkiness here, but otherwise still sort of letters designed to be used within the context of a typewriter. Here we have Amelia, which has a very interesting and unique look. I think that one that many will find familiar, despite it being kind of a weird amalgamation. It is a font that started in its overall form with some of the machine readable fonts. At the time they were using for machine character recognition, But then the designer added these very playful curves and swoops in it. This this very unusual G, kind of these mix of sharp pointed and rounded cutouts and letters. So it was sort of machine font, but then with a bit of almost like psychedelic swoopiness to it. So it had many different characteristics, but I think why it might be so recognizable to so many is that the Beatles used this for the Yellow Submarine, like putting it in the mass consciousness forever. Something that didn't make its way into the mass consciousness is this new alphabet. And this is a very strange one. It was really never meant to be used per se. It was created by a designer for an article in a design publication. But it was in response to the fact that early photo printing methods could really basically destroy the look of traditional typefaces due to issues with the resolution and how they worked. Really bad translation of those letter forms to the printed material. So this designer created not just a typeface, but in a sense new representations of letters using only horizontal and vertical lines to avoid that issue. This could maintain its readability. And in a way, it was just meant, in some sense, to be provocative, just questioning technology or how we look at this. Because I think to our eyes it is unreadable, with the A basically being a backwards L, U and W being differentiated by just this bar underneath the W. So it was really just a design study and question of how might we do typography. I think it's sort of quirky and interesting as a result. Maybe this is how humans will communicate in the future. I don't know. Here we have stop, which is a pretty wild design. It's a kind of unique construction of some of these letters, like the kind of continuous line that forms the A, the swooping backwards 3 that is the B. And this was really meant as just an eye-catching display typeface, something that you might have to look at and sort of digest. They describe it as a mix of 70s computer technology and retro sci-fi, which really is the things that I think of when I look at this. The way they've have these gaps in the letters, like the E, how the D isn't fully closed. The Z creates this interesting sort of set of lines and spaces within the text, which is quite distinctive, I think. Kind of an interesting approach to an unusual font. Here we have American Typewriter, which I find distinctive because I've definitely seen books from the 70s that use this. Obviously, it is a typeface inspired and meant to feel like an actual typewriter. But it has some unusual kind of details to it, like this very swoopy end of the R, similar with the Q. The new alphabet font was really kind of a response to changes in technology, which, with the photo composition freeing designers to do more things with font than they'd been able to do when it was just blocks of metal, led to them trying things that you can't really do on traditionally printed material, like have zero spacing between letters or set things incredibly tightly together, which I guess was a really short-lived trend, but showing an embrace of the new aspects of technology becoming available at the time. This was very popular throughout the 70s and 80s, and then basically kind of went out of fashion, I would say. This is a very interesting font to me. I don't know if you're old enough to have used actual phone books, but for those of us of advanced years, if you will, this is very familiar. It's a very distinctive appearance, and this is a font. It's called Bell Centennial, developed for the Bell Telephone Company, AT&T, and they needed a font that would be very legible and able to convey information when printed very small in a phone book. I think basically the small type is 6-point font, so it's very tiny. And in addition to that, it was going to be printed on low-grade newsprint paper. So it had to take into account any technical limitations and maintain that legibility through the printing process. So the type designer created a font very specifically for that purpose. He actually drew the letter forms at each size that they would be printed at, rather than just creating a large copy of the letter and shrinking it down, since at such small sizes, just the addition of a tiny bit could change the legibility of a letter. So you have to do it precisely at each size. So it's really kind of an interesting creation in terms of its very specific purpose to the font, and one which was executed brilliantly so that phone books are totally legible despite the limitations. Very much a case of function rather than form in type design. This is ITC's Galliard. And this is the font I mentioned at the start of the video. It is based on the Grandjean font we looked at. But I think importantly for this one, it was an inspiration where the spirit was captured rather than being a pure literal translation, which produced a very beautiful font that became widely popular as a result. another font that is very much designed for a specific purpose. This is Sassoon Primary. And this is a font designed for small children, for learning letters and words. It is meant to be easily identifiable to children, and the way they arrived at the design of this was to actually ask children what they found to be legible. And apparently children were pretty articulate about what letters they could recognize and what worked for them. So there are a few specific characteristics that emerge. The counters of letters, the spaces within them, are very wide and open, which helps you identify which letter is which. It is on a slight slant, and there are small little strokes called exit strokes at the end of letters, like this H, this N, and those really help flow that letter into the next one within the word. And if all that sounds like characteristics of the handwriting children learn, that is very much true. There appears to be very much a link there, a match between the way they're learning to write and how they recognize letters. This became a very widely used font for children's education as a result of its legibility. This is a very unusual font. And again, this is a font that was taking advantage of new technology that became available at the time, where you had things like Adobe PostScript was providing ways to convert computer text to printing. In Beowulf, the designers actually put in code that each time the letter was typed, the points defining it moved a bit randomly. So there would be variance in the text that was produced. And they actually did 3 different levels of this. So in the final version, it would be much more wild in terms of the result that you got. They viewed it as breaking outside of the technology, or rather our expectations of how it should work, and embracing technology. I think it's interesting that it ends up with something a little bit more like handwriting, and that each letter we produce is different. Kind of a crazy experiment, if you will. We have Trajan, maybe Trajan, I don't actually know. But this is a font that is directly based off of letters carved into Roman structures, and specifically Trajan's column, which was built to celebrate the emperor's victory in war. It is a typeface, these strong serifs, these kind of assertive capital look. That very distinctive long-tailed Q. And this one, I'm sure, is very familiar to everyone because movie posters embraced this heavily. I think early 2000s, maybe. I feel like it was sort of ubiquitous. And this is Myriad, which, again, I think will be familiar to many people. Apple uses this in their marketing materials. It's also a default font in Adobe products. One of the interesting things I learned from this book about this font is that the designers actually created it, the intent that it would be extremely generic. It was a font that they didn't really want to have a personality. And I suppose in that sense it works. It makes it applicable for many applications. But it has proved to be hugely popular. Here is another example of a type designer making a bit of a treatise on communication or type design. Minimum is a font that is entirely constructed out of straight lines, horizontal and vertical. It is still more legible than something like the new alphabet. It has these crazy italic shapes as well. About this font family, the designer stated sort of a phrase that defined it: to stamp out everything useless. You could argue as a response to geometric fonts and design and minimalism that maybe you could strip out too much, or maybe you should. I believe he made some variants that could be combined together or something like that. But as a result, when he was talking about uses for those different fonts, some of the uses he cited were for the darkness, when you have lost your gun, and when you are drunk. So honestly, as far as fonts go, I feel like he's covering more useful ground than a lot of type designers. So I'll take it. Our penultimate font here is Aleph. It was created by a graphic designer. Really wasn't even necessarily intended as a font for others to use, but to showcase his own work. But I thought it had a really interesting style to it. It is very evocative of calligraphy, which I believe was his intent. But it is built using just these vertical lines and these brushstroke style lines, with the divisions between letters, or between the strokes, kind of like a stencil font. But it creates kind of that calligraphy feel to it. You kind of have to work to read it, but I think in an interesting way. All right, so we've come quite a ways on our font journey, but we have to cap things off. And we will close out with the one that I know we've all been waiting for. Comic Sans, or Comic Sans, as it should probably be. Comic Sans. Widely known, often disparaged. The book has a joke here. Comic Sans walks into a bar. The bartender says, "We don't serve your type here." When you're next in the office around the water cooler, you can tell a font joke. The font, I didn't actually know the story of it. I assumed it was somehow inspired by comics, but it's actually, which is true, but it is a fairly recent font. In the 90s at Microsoft, a type designer had built some font for children, but saw a product that was planning to use Times New Roman for children, which he thought was a terrible choice. A very traditional newspaper font. So he decided to create a font that would be more appropriate, basing it on the lettering in comics. And he came up with Comic Sans, which they ended up bundling into all of the Microsoft software, making it available to all of us, and for it to begin its path towards taking over the world. It is interesting that it is often the butt of jokes, particularly among designers and artists. It is often put down, but part of that stems from the fact that it is so widely used, and the interesting thing is so many people like it. Its popularity stems from how it makes people feel. It's more friendly than a lot of fonts, playful. In some sense, the dislike is just a reaction to its popularity. And it is certainly okay to like things which aren't always the most sophisticated. In fact, the other direction can be quite tiresome sometimes. So, a font beloved by many, reviled by some. I think it's a good perspective, although if I go to certain restaurants and they're using it for their menu, I definitely do judge them. It really depends on the place. So there you have it, Comic Sans. And with that, we'll close out. I hope you have enjoyed a chance to look at a variety of fonts, and I hope you have a wonderful sleep. Good night.